Hey, welcome to my talk titled Let's Rethink UI Development with Nim. This is about a UI library that I've been working on called Fidget. So, my opinion is there's too many walled gardens in UI development right now. You have HTML5 apps, you have Android apps, you have iOS apps, you have macOS operating systems and Windows and Linux. There's so many of them, and a lot of them require very different UI libraries to work with. I think this is an absolute travesty. Like, we as the programmers have been led into these walled gardens, and we have to learn a whole new ecosystem to program for each one. This is really bad. That's why for Fidget, I'm trying to bridge all the walled gardens to provide a single UI library that can run on everything. Well, it's not true. There's one thing that can run everywhere, which is HTML5 through Electron or WebView, but I feel like this is insufficient. It is a very heavyweight. It is very hard to develop. HTML, CSS is quite complex and not intuitive, and it usually kind of has low performance as well. So I think there's a need for a native high-performance library that can span all platforms that is not HTML5. Okay, another thing that I'm noticing as a trend is death of native look and feel. What I mean by this is before operating system had their own UI set, their own icons, and apps would kind of try to look like part of the operating system they were in. And it made sense maybe then to have different UI frameworks for different operating systems. But that is not the case now. Everyone is basically, the native look and feel is gone. Everyone is trying to design, their own UI. I think it is the rise of what I'll call the rise of UX brands. So modern UI apps, they're basically branded with a company that's made them. You use branded colors, you use branded icons, you even use branded fonts. Like, it is very common for big UI apps to basically be completely different from each other, but be very on brand with the company that makes it. Another thing is soon, I think, will happen is the death of native fonts. So before, different operating systems kind of provided different fonts. This was very visible with macOS and Windows ClearType. macOS tried to be more true to what the font is, while Windows ClearType tried to make the font more readable. But I think that is going away as well. As we get high DPI screens, iOS and Android fonts, they look the same. The same thing with high DPI macOS and Windows fonts. The differences between the fonts are gone. What I'm saying here is the differences between the operating systems and the platforms and how you develop for them and how stuff is look, all that has kind of melted away. But we are still stuck with developing basically the apps that look almost identical on different platforms with different tools. And I think that is just boggles the mind how we got to this point. Another thing that I hate about modern UI stuff is laying out stuff by hand, and I think this happens a lot. We're basically, doing the same old, setting up font sizes, moving divs around or elements around, setting up margins and paddings and widths and heights, and I feel like we're just, it is just busy work. It doesn't need to be done. A lot of other industries have moved on from this kind of by hand laying stuff out. So there are various tools, but for some reason they're just not used. One of the tools is XCode, and yeah, you can lay out UIs with it. It works. Some people use it, but again, primarily in the industry, even for iPhone apps, XCode Visual Designer isn't used because it is just not comfortable to use. It just didn't find its perfect market fit. The same thing with Android Studio. Again, it exists there. You can lay stuff out with it. It works great. But again, programmers don't use it. Designers find it too hard, overly technical, and programmers probably find it overly too designery. They want to use code because that's what they know. There's other tools like Glade, which is open source, but again, modern UI doesn't start out with, oh yeah, let's make a UI in Glade. It is only useful for a very small subset. I don't know of any app that uses Glade, seriously. The other thing, I think the problem here is that UI, development isn't just one person. You have programmers and you have designers, and they're constantly talking with each other and have to use common tools. And I feel like one tool that really does that is Figma. I think Figma is a really cool tool. It has a lot of features that designers like. Designers prefer this tool. They don't prefer the XCode designer or the Android thing or Glade. Designers don't use that tool. Designers try to use tool that is the best for their craft, and I think Figma is really winning in that regard. I think from in the last couple of years, Figma has become from basically unknown to winning over industry heavyweights like Sketch and Illustrator. It is just taking world by storm. If you know a designer, they probably have heard of even using Figma now. And I think Figma is like an important UI layout tool to latch onto. So here's what my proposal. This is what Figma does. This is what Fidget does. Is it has a Figma plugin. So what you do is you draw stuff in Figma, then you use the export plugin to export some code into Nim, and you can just play Nim code out of that, and then you slowly modify that Nim code to fit your UI. You attach, you put for loops in there, you put if statements there, you modify the formatting, and I think this kind of synergy between the draw tool that designers already like and then the programming language, which is an excellent programming language, Nim, it can kind of work together really well. So here's how the Fidget exporter looks. It's actually pretty simple. You select an element and then you click export. There isn't much to it. And what you actually get Nim code that you can just copy paste into your Nim app and it will run. I can go ahead and copy. So here we have an example of the Nim code that it would generate. You just copy that Nim code and send it into your app and it'll work. It will render this UI. It won't be functional because it's just like an image. But then you slowly start insert little functionality in there. That's how it works. But you can also do that with small components. For instance, you can select this little bitty piece. Well, here I'm selected the design checkbox, and you can just click export, and you get little code for it. So if you were developing this app with Nim, you could basically create a function that's called checkbox, and then just copy paste the stuff into there. It's that simple. Basically what I want with this plugin is say no to manual work. I don't ever want to change colors, lay stuff out by hand. This is just busy work. This is not, it's just needed. We can just use the tools that already exist to do this stuff. Another thing I like about Figma is its minimalism. So I feel like Figma takes axioms of design and then builds up on them, unlike other tools. It basically starts with the basics and then just layer stuff onto it. But every layer stays simple. It's all I find it their ideas and how they laid stuff out kind of beautiful. That's why I want to copy Figma's stuff. So what Fidget tries to do is basically copy most of Figma's feature and its terminology. So when you use Figma, it just naturally flows into Fidget. Yeah, so terminology, I really like that. It's kind of simple. You just basically have, your frames, your groups, components, constraints, layers. You have your text, fill, and stroked, and different effects. And it's just it makes sense. While what we have, in CSS, we have patterns and margins. There's none of that. What is it for a designer? What is the difference between padding and margin? It just says it's all spaces. It's all spacing. Why is it different? It's just different. It's just weird, right? Again, we have we have panes and panels and divs and span. If you talk to a designer that doesn't know how HTML works, and you tell me, there's a div and there's a span, they'll look at it, those words don't make sense. The terminology there is bad, right? It's a group, it's a frame. Those things make sense. Divs and spans do not. The same thing with complex CSS layout stuff, border box. What even I don't I've used border box for a decade, and I still don't get why it's there. Position relative, it's you're always doing these mental CSS puzzles. It's just bad. I want none of that. I feel like Figma has and the same Figma has solved that. And the same thing with on the mobile side, you have UI view controllers and recycler views. Those things just don't make sense, really. I think there's simpler ways to accomplish this thing without going overboard in basic terminology. I really like how Figma does constraints, and I basically copy them. Constraints are very simple. You can be just attached to all the four sides, or be in the center, or be scalable. It is like you can see how the constraints will work in your app if you just go to Figma and you kind of mess with it a little bit, and you can actually see how the constraints work. You don't have to do it in code. You don't have to modify the code and refresh the thing to see how it works. No, you can just do it in Figma to see how it works and then just export it, right? You don't have to think about it. You don't have to solve these weird puzzles almost ever. The same thing with auto layout. Auto layout is the second part of how Figma does layout, and I think that's simple. I think between constraints and auto layout, you can do almost all layouts you want, right? With that layout, you have vertical and horizontal, and then you can put spaces between them. It's great. It's very simple. It's like axioms of design, right? You can't go simpler, and that's what I like, and that's what I copied into Fidget. The same thing with components. Components in Figma are kind of like function calls, right? It's basically you create a component and then you basically just stamp it everywhere with minor modifications. You can actually modify it slightly, and yeah, I find components to be a really good. It's just like function calls. I think a lot of I just want to map all of Figma's things into Fidget. Again, something that you will not find in Figma is built-in controls. There isn't a button and this is a tab and this is a link. No, there's none of that. You basically get a rectangle, some text, and an image, and then you build controls out of them. Why? Because I think Figma and Fidget they try to do this for kind of axioms of design. They're not trying to overcomplicate things. A lot of times in the current UI development, I have a button, but I want a button to be slightly different. And it's no, tough luck. The button is some special thing that's we don't know how it is made. It's hard to make. It's you can't make a real button to look like a button. But no, not in Figma. Everything in Figma is basically, you can build it from scratch, right? Look at this control here. There's no additional cost to making, strange controls. This is a very simple control, right? It's composed of 3 elements, right? You have text, you have a little circle thing that moves from side to side, and then you have the kind of the background element where it moves in, right? You can build that and it'll exist, and then you can reuse that component over and over in your thing, and it isn't some control I prescribed from on high, right? It is something that you built out of simpler parts. That's the basic of how I want Fidget to work. Okay, we are also in another great UI paradigm shift. So we're shifting from object-oriented UIs to what I would call reactive UIs. So what object-oriented UIs to me are kind of these things where you basically create a bunch of elements at the start, add a bunch of elements together, attach a bunch of callbacks to them, and then as you do stuff in those callbacks, you remove and add more elements, and all the elements are basically objects, and they sit with each other. I find that very hard and very error prone because it's easy to forget to remove stuff, easy to forget you have callbacks, you always have to it's difficult to work with. And that's why I think reactive is taking over. Reactive is basically, you change one in one place, it'll change in all places for you automatically, right? You don't have to think about these updates and this callbacks. It's kind of all just happens almost in line, right? And this is what I wanted to do in Fidget as well. So what I call it is the transform. So Fidget to me is a big transform. You have some internal data representation, which is a tree structure. You have your hash tables and your lists and your objects in there. And what I want Fidget to be is kind of almost a linear transfer where you just you walk over your internal data and you produce what user sees, right? And it's very functional almost, it doesn't have a lot of state. Your internal data has all this state, but the UI itself, no, it just takes the internal data and produces a picture of what it should look like to a user. If you change the internal data, the user thing will just be updated if you run the function again. This is basically what I want to kind of get by stateless mode. So this is kind of similar to what immediate mode UI does, dear imGUI, right? That and it's also kind of the idea is kind of similar to reactive programming, so React and Angular, but I feel I take it even farther, and I'll show how. One thing I also do, so mine isn't truly image GUI, right? It is slightly different here. So I actually do have an internal node representation. So when I said it is purely functional, it's kind of a lie. I actually do a fancy diffing in between here. So for some things like animation, you actually want to know what the previous state was, and this is what I can get. If you want to like fade things or fade stuff out, again, I know what the color of the previous node was, so I can actually fade stuff in. And the same with typing text as well. As users typing, you want to, you don't want to keep that information in your internal data, like where the cursor is. That is all handled by this kind of a node differ that sits in between. But usually, if you're just using a library, you don't have to know about it. It just kind of happens magically. Again, with this linear transform, I want to really get back to QBASIC. When I learned programming, I learned with QBASIC, and I felt it was easy. You just used if statements, for loops, and functions, right? And I think we as programmers have kind of got away from it into like complex land where you have, templates, callbacks, all kinds of like weird things, styles and just like, yeah, no, I actually, like modifiers and observers, right? No, I want to get rid of all that. I want to get back to like the simpler ways where we just had basically print statements, for loops, if and function calls, right? This is where I want Fidget to be. It's kind of like this simple linear thing. So again, this is what my linear transform is. You walk over data linearly. You can put a print statement anywhere and it will show, hey, I'm here. You can put a debug breakpoint anywhere. It will just stop the UI drawing where you were so you can inspect everything. I think linear is just simpler than this kind of weird thing that we as programmers got to with our very complicated abstractions. I just want to get cut away through all of that. So here's like a minimal Fidget example. So here we have an import statements at the top to import Fidget. Yeah, we have this draw proc that we defined, and yeah, it draws a frame. And here I'm using awesome NIM's DSL and meta programming features. Here we have a frame template which basically takes a body, and so we have a frame called main. We set its size. And then, here I'm laying out stuff kind of in code for I in 0 to 4. I'm going to create 4 blocks. But yeah, you can use the more advanced features for that. But here it's a minimal example, so I'm just going to do that really quick. Yeah, and you just have box and you lay it out. Box, in code, it's like really easy, and you'll get 5 boxes. And then we have start Fidget. We throw the draw main function, which will be called when it needs to be. And then we have the width and the height. Yeah, and then here's what it looks like. Just a minimal example in Windows, right? We just have 4 or 5 boxes here. Yeah, very simple. Yeah, and this is running natively, so it's actually running through OpenGL. So all these boxes are drawn in OpenGL. Really cool. But it is cooler. We can also run Fidget in JavaScript mode. So nim, you can actually compile to JavaScript, and here we were running it in JavaScript. And what it does is it actually creates five divs for us. And yeah, if you inspect them, they're just like normal divs that you would create with other framework, right? It is here. Like I'm trying to bridge the walled gardens. I'm trying to go from native where you use OpenGL to web where you primarily use divs in the DOM, right? I'm just trying to bridge all those gaps. But I can go even further. Here we are running actually with HTML5, but we're using WASM through Emscripten. So this is actually going back. So this is drawing in the web browser, but using WebGL, just like it does in the native land. And you can actually see it's only a single canvas tag on the page that like where everything is drawn. And you can do that too. Like again, I'm trying to bridge like however you want to ship your app and however you want your app to work. You can do whatever. Again, we can look through these, minimal example. Now we saw what it looks like. We can go through it again. Here, I'm basically defining blocks. I start with 20. That's like my padding. Then for every I multiply by 120 to kind of shift the box in the X direction. Yeah, and again, a lot of cool things here. Again, meta programming with templates, frame. It's like a simple DSL that you use. It just looks clean. If you are using Figma to draw your stuff, all this stuff will come for free. You just click export and you get all these numbers, right? You don't have to like think of them in your head. You just kind of, the numbers. You just kind of fall in. Here's a more complicated example. Here I'm drawing bars. And as we go here, you can see I'm drawing a bunch of bars. I start a bar. I'm using the same layout stuff, not to make it overcomplicated. Here is actually a really interesting thing. So we can actually here, you can see if the current bar does not overlap the screen, which happens because you scrolled off, it actually doesn't draw it. So there's no extra stuff happening. This is what like a recycle view controller where it actually doesn't, you can have thousands and thousands of these bars or a million even on screen. but you're just not drawing them. They're actually not even in code. It skips them in the if statement, right? It's great. And this is how you can do, like, infinite scroll and a lot of things. You're just like, oh, if it's not on screen, again, not something complicated. It's just an if statement that allows you to be this powerful, right? And again, here we have like an onHover, again, another like template that will just, if the mouse is hovering and then onClick. Let's see what it looks like. So this is what the bars look like. I'm drawing a bunch of bars. I'm creating, again, using the nim-DSL to create the bars. It works. It's great. And you can actually click on you can click here and here to make the bars grow and shrink. Yeah, and you can do this actually everywhere. So here I have the same app that you just saw, the same code running. Where is it running? Running on iOS over here. Then it's running on Android, running on emulator, so I can get a screenshot. Then we have it running natively on Mac OS, and then we have it, running in the web browser, right? Like the thing about Fidget is just want to transform, how the UIs are done. How our onHover is implemented, this I think is really neat. So again, I have these templates, and they might look complicated. You might say, oh, just replacing templates with something more complicated. But no, actually, if you look at the onHover, how the template for onHover looks like, it's actually 2 lines. It's really simple. It's all simple if statements and for loops and function calls all the way down. I really tried to make it follow like the basic axioms here. So yeah, if the mouse overlaps the thing that we're drawing, then we execute the overlap object. Otherwise, we don't. It is that simple, right? It will just call the inner stuff. You can put whatever you want on hover. Here, I'm just calling the fill, which will set the fill of the current current object. So yeah, it's like really simple. Again, with onClick, it's the same thing. onClick, if the mouse overlaps it and you clicked it, you call in the code. It isn't some sort of callback. It's not even a closure. It's not a callback. It's not a closure. It's not any kind of like, there's no async or anything going on here. It is just code in line. You can put a breakpoint here and you click on onClick, it'll just hit here, and you know exactly what you've drawn beforehand and afterhand. It is I think really powerful. Okay, I wanted to push this even farther. So yeah, clicking and hovering is all good, but you can also use this for getting HTTP stuff. Yeah, it's crazy. So here I will show you how to do HTTP calls without async, without callback, without threads. It's really cool. So here we go. So here we're drawing a very similar thing. We load Fidget, we load a font, we set the title kind of, and then we draw the single text thing. We're going to draw it in the same font we just loaded. Here we do what I call HTTP get, which is going to get this thing, and we're going to get a call. While the call is kind of like a future, maybe, but not quite. There's nothing. So it's just the call. So we check the status of the call. If it's ready, then we draw with the black characters. We'll draw our IP. So this API actually goes in and gets our IP. Sometimes it's hard to know what our IP address is. So when we're behind multiple NATs, so this gets our public IP address if you hit this API endpoint. So here we go. We just will draw that API endpoint. When we hit it, it will draw our IP. If we get an error, we actually set the color to red and we draw error. If we're still loading, we'll actually get the loading thing. So the cool thing, so this is how it looks. What is my IP? And then it gives you my public IP over here. This is a native Windows app. It works, HTML as well. Again, we didn't have to make fancy AJAX call or HSR or whatever. I don't know. It's all built in. It all just works. You get your IP address. I want to talk more about how the call works. So the interesting thing about the call is you actually get the call. So the first time this runs, we get the call, and then for the first time, it's not going to be ready because we just made it not going to have an error because they haven't had a chance to error out yet. It's actually going to go here in this else branch. It's going to print loading, right? And then it's going to just wait. The UI will not redraw if there's no need to redraw, right? But when this thing finishes, the internal system will go, hey, I have an HTTP call that has finished. Let's redraw the UI. So it'll call draw main again, and we'll draw the text. And we'll diff the text with the previous text, so it doesn't have to do a bunch of work. But it'll go the text, and it'll go here, and it'll go status. Oh, we actually have finished. The call has finished. Let's set the color to black, and let's print the IP address, right? If there was an error, for instance, this site is down, you don't have network connection, it'll go status error, and we'll say error. And that's how it works. There's no callbacks. It's all linear. Again, you can put breakpoints and statements in here. You can put this in functions, right? There isn't these extra gunk or complexity that you have to learn. It is just, again, you can go ahead and look at how HTTP GET is implemented. It's quite simple. Yeah, okay, so for my last example, what I want to do is I want to re-implement Hacker News. So pretty much everyone's familiar with what Hacker News is. So here what I did is I drew a Hacker News clone in Figma. So what I do is I started drawing the header, I put a logo in there, put the Y in there, the logo has a white border around it, then I have the title, Hacker News, right? That's the header component. Then I drew another component, which is a news component. All of these are components are part of the auto layout, which is a horizontal layout. You can see they all just stack nicely. It figures it out for us. In the news component, I have two lines, which are this is horizontally stacked over here. So we have our first line, which is, I guess, start with the domain. Then we have our title. Then we have our score, which is 1. So they all stack horizontally. Then we have over here, we have the second line again. They stack horizontally again. We have like the comments. We have the bar. We have a couple buttons. We have more stuff. So yeah, and then what I do is I just go to the plugin and I hit export and I get this stuff. And this is what would draw this thing in Fidget. So then what I do is I just copy it to my program. But yeah, drawing this, it doesn't have any functionality. It's just drawing. So we have to add functionality next. So this is what I do is I kind of break it out and make it more abstract. Is I create a header function and then I create a news function, and that's where those things will live in. So here I use HTTP GET again. I use the Hacker News API, which is a Firebase API. Anyone can use it. So what I do is I hit the top stories. So again, I have a call. At first it will be nothing, so just draw the header, so it'll just be a header and no news at all. But when the call finishes, it will call this domain again, and it will get to the call, and it will say, hey, the call is ready. Okay, let's try it. And the call actually doesn't give us the stories, it gives us the IDs only to the stories. So we actually gets about a bunch of IDs. I only grabbed 15 IDs here, because that's what I wanted to do. So for every ID, I get it, and then I send it to the news function, and let's take a look at what the news function has. This is the news function. I have the header function over here, which has the header stuff. Then I have the news function over here, which takes a string ID, and then I call another HTTP GET. So this is like nested HTTP GETs in there. If you were implementing this with callbacks, this would be kind of nasty, I would say. You would have like a callback inside a callback, and you have to like handle errors, right? And if you're using exceptions, or if you're using a sync, for instance, from Nim, they could be kind of nasty. But here it's so linear. It's so linear, just function call with an if statement, right? How complicated can this be? Again, we check for its status. If it's not ready, we just return no news is drawn. But when the news is drawn, we draw the news frame, and that's the same thing that I had in the, from Figma that I put into Fidget. So, we have the first line and we have the second line. I'm not going to go over everything how I did it. I just want to look at like the domain text object. So here we have the domain text object. It is drawn. I did not modify this code at all. This is just directly from the plugin. The only two lines I modified were these. So here what I do is I parse the URL from the call that we just got, and that has the URL of the story, and then I stick the characters into URL. And characters exactly, and then I just put the text on, and I do this for all the little text fields that I have, and voila, we have a Windows Hacker News app. It has the Hacker News stories. You have your score, who made it, everything. It's just here. This is the Hacker News Windows app. I made this in about an hour. It was very simple. Once you know how to use Figma, and code just writes itself basically. Yeah, pretty cool. Warning though, Fidget is still alpha quality, so there's still a lot of stuff to be done. This is not a final product. I'm still developing it. It would be cool if you can come and check it out and maybe, contribute some bug reports. But yeah, creating a whole new UI framework with basically a whole new UI paradigm will take a long time. So yeah. Thank you for listening to my talk. Let's rethink how we do UI development with Nim. If there's things I want you to take away. Say no to walled gardens. Don't use platform. Use cross-platform things. Make sure it works everywhere. Web and mobile, right? Don't lay out stuff by hand. It's just stupid. Use tools that other people, the designers, can use that can actually create you nice UIs too. And then Fidget is pretty cool. It's like pioneering a bunch of like UI paradigms that you probably haven't seen, and think linear, callbacks, async, and like all that stuff is hard. Just linear code without callbacks is much easier to debug, much easier to reason about. Yeah. Thank you very much.